You were guaranteed more likely to die of disease than battle. Both forces came down with smallpox, and when the ones on the lakes turned back, the other was left alone to face the united force at New France at Quebec. So, since the one army turned back, the French were able to put all their forces into the battle against the other small army. Outnumbered and suffering from cold, wet weather, as well as illness, the second English force also turned back in October of 1690. The war degenerated into savage frontier encounters and maritime commerce raiding. The French lacked the population for sustained offensives, 20-1, remember, and the English lacked the will, just like Athens used to lack the willpower to carry on a lot of its wars, because it would go on for a year or two, and then someone would get up in assembly and make some impassioned speech, and the whole assembly would dash the whole war effort to the ground, and 6 months later they'd have to take it up again. Insanity, because they lacked willpower, because they were to the whims of the crowd, and it takes good leaders to keep it together, and sometimes good leaders weren't there to step up. The English lacked the will. Their assemblies were ever slow to vote money for defense and to cooperate with one another. Thus the war fell most heavily on frontier settlements, right? So because the whole society wasn't doing anything in the war effort, it was the frontier settlements that would take it hardest. On local militia units and on Indian allies. The government of on the allies, Indians who are allied to the English. The governments, now, let's pause there for a second. That's a good note, isn't it? It's one thing to say the English came here and were aggressive in taking land from the Indians and kicked them off, but let's remember how many Indians agreed with the English that the English system should grow, and helped the English, and were willing to trade with the English, and were willing to buy and use their goods and stuff. So, the warfare fell most heavily on frontier settlements, local militia, Indian allies. That's right, the Indians helped us take the continent. Us as in Anglo-English Europeans, white Europeans of general European stock, took over this continent with the help of Indians. So let's not hear too much more boo-hooing. You know, let's not hear any more boo-hooing about the goddamn filthy Indians and their Stone Age idiocy, okay? The governments of England and France did little more than send warships to the West Indies and return all conquests and prisoners at the Peace of Ryswick. They returned all conquests. We'll hear a little bit more about a conquest that was returned that was a little... It didn't go over very well. A bit later on. Next to Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. It began much the same way as King William's War had ended, with fighting across the frontiers and commerce raiding at sea. So now on to Queen Anne's War, 1702-1713. It began much as King William's War had ended, with fighting across frontiers and commerce raiding at sea. So the other war had sort of degenerated into that. Remember, the two parties set it up to invade Canada, and that didn't happen. That just frontier fighting degenerated into this system, and now this war starts off with those tactics. Those are familiar tactics. Let's just go forward with what we were doing before. South Carolinians and the Spanish colonists in Florida did do more than raid frontier settlements. They attacked unsuccessfully at St. Augustine, Charleston, and Pensacola in the opening years of the war. But for 8 years, New Englanders and the French Canadians mainly skirmished in the wilderness and on the high seas. Although the population was growing steadily in the British and French colonies, the French continued to lack the resources for a regular campaign. Right? Just the size of their society dictates that. They hoped that striking at the frontiers of New England would forestall an invasion of Canada or any extension of New English settlements. So if they just keep attacking the English, then the English will not go on the offensive. Brilliant. I'm not sure that's what they really believe. It's just the textbook that says that. New Englanders began the war without the help of New York and the Iroquois. both of whom preferred to remain neutral. Massachusetts did raise 1,900 men to garrison its frontiers and engage hostile Indians. Yet with money and labor scarce, it was difficult both to garrison frontier posts and support an invasion of Canada, to raise the volunteers needed for prolonged service away from home. More of a problem than just paying the men something. You pay them and you get them to leave their house and stuff, but now what about the stuff that has to be going on their farm and stuff? It's back when 97-98% of people were farmers. It was difficult to banish the memory of New England's disastrous expedition to Canada in 1690. Thus, until Britain provided direct support in the war, Massachusetts remained mainly on the defensive, absorbing damaging attacks on towns like Deerfield and Haverhill, and responding with raids on the coast of what is now Maine and unsuccessful attempts to capture Port Royal. So we could say they sort of were involved in limited naval actions, rather than what some people wanted, which was an invasion of Canada, but they just couldn't make it happen. Again, they tried it earlier, so they were scared. When Britain did support the colonists, the results were decidedly disappointing. In 1708, New Englanders persuaded the British government to join in conquering Canada. So now they got the British government on their side. It's not just the American hoopla, it's now the British crown in on it, okay? Fine. Anticipating the arrival of British forces in 1709, the New Englanders lured New York and the Iroquois from their neutrality and enlisted volunteers for an expedition to Quebec. But the British government, hoping the war would end, delayed sending help until 1710. So they were like, sure, yeah, go ahead. Go on with your battles. Yes, we'll join you. Hold those ships. Don't send anybody. Diabolical bastards. So they hoped the war would end. The Marines joined the colonists in capturing Port Royal. Only in 1711 did the British provide regular forces enough for an invasion of Canada. 4,300 soldiers, 12 warships, and 40 transports. The colonists responded enthusiastically, if not cooperatively. When in June the British reached Boston, the townspeople raised prices on provisions and obstructed British efforts to recruit seamen and pilots. Now that's what a free economy would do when a bunch of people land in town. The price of everything should double or triple. But that offended the British. You know, the British probably had some sort of controls over their economy, so the prices were controlled, and thousands of colonists did volunteer to accompany the British to the St. Lawrence, and thousands more assembled for a separate colonial expedition across the lakes to Montreal, but the volunteers were not well disciplined or trained. To get the numbers of men required for such operations, the colonists had to recruit many men outside the militia, marginal members of society. Now, the British, you know, they certainly considered the general militia to be marginal members of society. So now the marginal members of society who run the militia have to recruit even more marginal members of society. These were members of society who saw military service as a chance to improve their fortunes. They're not being conscripted or anything. This is an opportunity for them. The British were not pleased with the quality of these provincial volunteers or with Bostonians' efforts in preparing the fleet. And when 8 ships went aground on reaching the St. Lawrence, the British promptly cancelled the attack on Quebec, and the invasion of Canada collapsed amid mutual recrimination. Now, sort of general incompetence, I think, that led to that. But we'll hear a little bit more about... The British troops were very regimented, and the colonists were very sort of spontaneous and free, and their organization, while it was more costly and took longer, oftentimes was more efficient than the regimented British system, which couldn't adapt to the situation. But let us continue. During King William's and Queen Anne's wars, the British had gradually become superior to the French at sea,